Good evening, everyone. It's a hard task to follow behind such really inspiring and entertaining speakers. As a lawyer, you don't expect lawyers to crack jokes, and it's sometimes very hard to bring jokes into this. But I am one of those lawyers that actually does genuinely believe that, in fact, law can be truly inspiring. And I'm wanting, yes, I have slides. I'm wanting to actually bring you on a bit of a journey, not so much about law, but in fact how we can kind of move forward here by going back in time. Because I think law has caused a lot of the problems. And if it's caused a lot of the problems, then why don't we use it to help make part of the solutions? And the reason I say that is that I think what we've done is we've created a legal framework, nationally and internationally, in many, many countries, that has basically commoditized the planet, put a price tag on it. That's all about the law of property. It's about I own. It's about how much does this cost? I can buy it, I can sell it. I can have a contract for this tract of land. I can make money out of it. In fact, it is the law for corporations to maximize their profits. Now, that causes sometimes a moral conundrum. What do you do when you're sitting in a board of directors and your company makes an awful lot of money out of something that also happens to cause mass damage and destruction to the earth? Do you sit there and say, I'm kind of concerned about this, that it causes mass damage and destruction? Problem is, the company lawyer will say, yes, well, but never mind about that. It is the law that you maximize your profits. That's what counts here. It doesn't really count that you cause mass damage and destruction. So what's happened here is that law itself has caused a miscarriage of justice, an imbalance of the scales of justice, if you will. This is the predominant way here that you can see in the slide on the left-hand side. The predominant way that we run and govern our systems. How we govern climate negotiations. If we look at what's happening there, it's very much about how do we put a price tag on things? How do we create markets? Problem is when we do that, by imposing a value, we create a disconnect. We don't actually look to the consequences. And I say that we can redress this by using a different form of engagement, different types of laws that are based on trusteeship. So instead of I own, it's about we owe a duty of care, because what happens there is we take responsibility. Duty of care is a legal term. Taking responsibility is a legal term as well. It's not a term that turns up often in property law or contracts. But it is something that we can put in place, trusteeship law principles, because what happens there is we become guardians, we become stewards of the earth, and we look long term. In fact, at the moment, what we see here is a system that puts the annual return, the quarterly return. Even now we have day traders who within a 24-hour period, their sole job on a trading floor is to maximize profits. Shift the balance, and what we do is we look to future generations. Something quite different happens because we look to the intrinsic value, not just the imposed value. But I'd like to take you back 200 years to a time when William Wilberforce was alive, and he sat down underneath an oak tree when he was really quite young, in his early 20s, and he had a moment of inspiration where he decided that he'd take up the mantle for the abolition of slavery. Now, that was at a time when it was utterly inconceivable ever to get rid of slavery. He realized there were three very important things that needed to be done. We needed to pull the subsidies, that it had to be outlawed, and then subsidies put into the innovation in the other direction. Most importantly, what I learned from William Wilberforce was that he wasn't interested in closing down corporations. He wanted to make the problem into the solution. And I think that that's what we could do here as well today, in this world, in our lifetimes. Of course, when William Wilberforce came along, he discovered that industry put up a whole wall of objections. They said, you can never get rid of slavery. It's a necessity. Get rid of slavery, it will lead to economic collapse, not just in Britain, but right across the world. And what's more, the public demanded. Instead, what were proposed were other solutions. Leave us to work this out, industry said. We don't need any more laws. We've already got far too many laws. Voluntary is the way forward, self-regulation. But if you really have to push this, well, maybe we can limit the numbers, put a cap on how many slaves can be traded in any given year. And we could create an internal market within that, so that if you've done, or you could offset it, a cap and trade system, in effect. It wasn't called that, but that's what it was. Essentially, leave it to market forces to resolve this problem and hand out tradable permits. In fact, one industry insider proposed into Parliament improving the conditions by putting more hay in the bedding coming across in the ships. Given that 2/3 of slaves actually died in transit, it wasn't the hay that was going to make the difference. Now, William Wilberforce's point was that actually, no, it's not about asking everyone to use their slaves a little less. That's just an energy efficiency exercise. No, this is about a moral imperative. Morally, this is wrong, and it's the moral imperative that trumps the economic imperative. But we can manage this, and we can do it in such a way that we don't have economic collapse. Now, William Wilberforce actually died a happy man. When he died, in fact, 2 days before he died, the major laws were put in place to close the door to slavery, and that had a ripple effect right across the world. And in fact, it led on to many other things after that. For instance, we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not white man's rights. And we also have race discrimination. And that arose out of the ripples that came from that. But I'd like to compare, there were 300 companies back then that were engaged in slavery, either directly or indirectly, and compare it to the situation today. And what we see is really a different form of enslavement. I'm sure a lot of you recognize this, one of these pictures. It's of the Athabasca tar sands, a toxic tailing pond in Canada, one of the world's largest hidden ecocides. The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report identified 3,000 corporations that are causing the majority of the mass damage and destruction to the earth. But what we're seeing today are the same objections. The difference is that the proposals that we've made, we've tried them. They're the same proposals that were put 200 years ago. We tried them this time round, and they haven't worked. So there's an opportunity for different thinking here that can be used. And this is really where we can actually then bring in place an international law of ecocide. Literally close the door to the mass damage and destruction. Did you know this? During wartime, it is already an international crime to cause mass damage and destruction. But during peacetime, you can do it all the time. But William Wilberforce didn't just do this on his own. In fact, there were many others who also pushed for the moral imperative to trump the economic imperative. And one of them in particular was a man called Charles Grant. And I think that what we need are the Charles Grants of today. Charles Grant was one of the biggest chief executives of his days. In fact, he was also a director of the British East India Club, British East India Company. And the British East India Company was one of the biggest companies of its time, which of course benefited hugely from slavery. Charles Grant did something truly remarkable. He stood up and said, "This is wrong, this must stop." And when he did that, two remarkable things happened. He gave permission for other leaders within industry to stand up and speak out. He demonstrated bold, moral, courageous leadership. And when he did that, governments listened and they acted. So we're looking for a visionary business leader. We think that actually this is about what we do with the earth today. The earth is in our hands. What we do next is up to us. And this is about changing the rules of the game of life. So we've put out an advert because we believe this is the biggest job on earth, to find the Charles Grants of this world who can stand up and speak out and support those laws that actually will close the door to the damage and destruction, but open up the door and prioritize innovation in another direction. No longer putting profit first at all costs, but putting people and planet first. Like Charles Grant will literally stand up and speak out and say the moral imperative must trump the economic imperative, and let's create the legislative framework to allow us to find the innovation in the other direction. So ladies and gentlemen, help me find my Charles Grant. We believe that there are people like him, or Charlize Grants, out there who can stand up and speak out. Please do visit whoischarlesgrant.com. Nominate. Or if you're a big chief executive sitting in this crowd, please put yourself forward. We're very keen to find our Charles and Charlize Grants and ask them to speak up and speak out on behalf of people and planet. Thank you very much.